go and get started. Good with the Zoom. Yep. Okay. So in this section, in this section, what we want to do is we want to present a case to show that the Quran is from Allah, but do that without reference to the Arabic language. Okay. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, number one, we claim, okay, the Quran is a linguistic and literary miracle, and the Quran, is the best expression of the Arabic language, and the Quran has supernatural eloquence. The Quran is inimitable. Okay, but all of that is contingent upon you knowing Arabic, right? So now, when you go to someone and you say, "Look, man, like it's a divine miracle, linguistic miracle of Allah," the one thing they might tell you, "Well, I don't know Arabic." Right? So why this argument is to do away with, okay, even if you don't know, there's still a way to show that the Quran is from Allah without knowing Arabic, the Arabic language. Okay, this is what this argument does. Now let me preface this with the following. This is not a case for you to not study Arabic. Okay. I don't want you to take that away from this. In fact, I want you to take the opposite away from this. Okay. If you are not studying Arabic, have a program that you are engaging with the Arabic language in some form or fashion. Okay. So I don't want you to take away from this like, well, children want to follow Arabic also, right? Because obviously the Quran is in Arabic. It's it's in order to really truly appreciate the Quran, to take from the Quran, to taste the Quran. All of that happens with the Arabic language. And just on a side, a lot of people think like, okay, learning Arabic is such a really difficult language to learn. And the reality is, you want to at least go step by step and at least learn some of the basics, such you can access the Quran, some hadith. That's not as hard as thinking about the entire Arabic language, right? So yeah, maybe you can't, go to Morocco and order a shawarma, right? Whatever it might be. And they call it. Anyway, I'm on this Moroccan trip today. I wonder why. Anyway, so point being is that have some sort of program that you're engaged in. Okay. Because even if you're taking it slowly, when I started studying the Arabic language, I was actually working full time, and at that time there was this thing called Real Player. Anyone know what that is? If you know what it is, I know you're really old. So Real Player were like these really like scruffy videos, right? It's like the precursor to YouTube, okay? And people would upload these videos, and it's just a scratchy video, but there was this one sheikh out of Dallas, he's Turkish, and he had uploaded like 45 lectures on Nahwu and another like 50 lectures on Sarf, right? So Arabic grammar, Arabic apology. And every morning I would just spend 10 minutes and go through these every single morning, right? To get notes online. But what I'm trying to get with this is that it doesn't have to be something that's so intense that you take a full, 3-month course on it, and then, or you don't do it at all. Even if you take it piecemeal, you'll still gain quite a bit, right? So at least have some sort of program where you're engaged with the Arabic language. Okay. So with that disclaimer in mind, let us proceed. Okay, what are we going to be looking at? The structure of what we are going to be going through today. We're going to be looking at, number one, the background to the argument. That's going to involve something known as the epistemology of testimony, which we touched on yesterday, but we'll just reiterate it today as well. We're going to look at something known as the inference to the best explanation. All right. Once we have that background, the structure of the argument is as follows. Number one, the Quran presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity. Remember, we said that it's a okay. So it presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity. Number two, the 7th century Arabs were best placed to challenge the Quran. Number three, the 7th century Arabs failed to meet the challenge. Number four, scholars have testified to the Quran's inadmissibility. Number five, counter-scholarly testimonies are not plausible, so as they have to reject the established background information to get into. Therefore, from number five, the Quran is inadmissible. By the way, anyone know what inadmissible means? You cannot imitate it. Very simply put, okay? It's a fancy way of saying it. It's actually in practice, I would say it, but anyway. So it is inadmissible. The possible explanation for the Quran's inadmissibility are either authorship by an Arab, authorship by a non-Arab, authorship by the Prophet ﷺ, or authorship by Allah. Now, as a deductive argument, we will show that the best explanation is that the author of the Quran, the one who brought the Quran, or the one the Quran is from Allah. So we'll do that deductive. We'll show it cannot have been Arab, it cannot have been non-Arab, and it cannot have been the Prophet. Okay? Now that's just an overall structure of the argument. Let us proceed. So, number one, testimony. Like I said, we touched upon this yesterday. Testimony is knowledge you gain from the say-so of others. And as I said yesterday, it is probably your source of knowledge more than any other source. Most of what you know comes from the say-so of others. All right. So yesterday we talked about, science, right? We said, okay, in science you do experiments. The experiments happen, and so people were like, well, wait a minute, we can tell you how the world is round because without testimony. But we weren't able to do that, were we? All right. So again, so we do the experiment again? No? It's like, no. Okay. So I think you guys remember that we said that knowledge from the say-so of others, simply put, is basically a major part of epistemology. Most of what you know comes from the say-so of others. Even when it comes to the realm of science, most of the science you know does not come from you yourself doing the experiment. It comes from you reading about someone who did the experiment, or reading about someone who read about someone who read about someone who did the experiment. So most knowledge comes from testimony. Okay, so we ask the question: when and how does testimony yield evidence? Is testimonial knowledge based upon other sources of knowledge? Is testimonial fundamental? All right. So there's a quote here from Professor Benjamin Myler. He says, "Here are a few things that I do know. I know that the copperhead is the most common venomous snake in the Greater Houston area. I know that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. I know that as I write, the average price of gasoline in the U.S. is $4.10 per gallon. All of these things I know on the basis of what epistemologists call testimony, on the basis of being told of them by another person or another group of persons." Okay, so hopefully it's clear. Most of what you know is based on testimonial sources. Okay, clear? Everyone at this point should be crystal clear. Yeah? Anyone disagree? No? Fair enough. All right. So testimony itself is fundamental. What's interesting is that testimony allows you to expand your what we call epistemic limitations. Okay, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when you rely upon testimony, that is when you actually get to learn more things than just by direct experimentation or direct experience. Okay. Now, by the way, this is really interesting when you think about the concept of language itself. Okay, and how language is tied to knowledge. Okay, do animals have a sophisticated language system? Sophisticated language system? No. All right. If they do, it's going to be really, really basic. Okay. It is only the human being that can express certain concepts, intangible concepts, for instance. Okay. And if you think about what language is at its core, what is language? Let's say you have a certain feeling that you have inside yourself. You're feeling angry. You can take this term, angry, a certain sound, let's say you're talking about orthography, a certain spelling, and you attach angry to this feeling. Is the feeling and the word the same? No, it's not, right? Now, here's what's interesting is that the word is a sign of the feeling. Your entire perception of what you know when you learn by language is based on signs. In a sense, it's based on ayat. Language itself is a reflection of the reality. Okay? And so when you start thinking about why did Allah make the Quran a linguistic miracle, and you start looking at the philosophy of language itself, you find that it actually makes more sense for the Quran to be a linguistic miracle than for it to be a miracle in any other sphere, including science. Why? Because language is at the core of how we gain knowledge itself, how we're able to extend epistemic limitations. All right, so when I say epistemic limitations, something you experience directly, if you just did everything yourself, you'd be in trouble. But the fact that you can read something writing, you can hear a person's lecture, you can learn from another person by way of language, means whatever limitations you have, you're able to extend. Okay? And that's what the says to others. So Dr. Elizabeth Fricker, she mentioned something really interesting. She says, we don't think much about it, but we're actually quite dependent on other people for our knowledge sources, for many things. So she says, I extend my epistemic limitation, for instance, by going to the mechanic. I don't study everything there is to know about my car, so I rely on their knowledge in order to help. I extend my epistemic limitations when I'm sick and I go to a doctor. I rely upon their knowledge and their, in a sense, testimony to extend my epistemic limitations. That reliability, there's an area of philosophy known as social ontology. Social ontology is basically the idea that your knowledge is based on your society. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. And then society kind of gives valuation to certain things. So if I was to pull out like a dollar bill, we understand it's worth $1, right? Is that value, does it come from the actual paper? Is it intrinsic to the paper? No, it comes from a societal ontological assigning a value to that dollar bill. Okay, so when we talk about social ontology, it applies to language as well. Why does the word angry mean the word angry? It's because we all understand, right? Not by some sort of contract we sign, and you will therefore now henceforth use the word angry to mean this. That's not how it works. But through some sort of social process of agreement in what words mean, we come to the idea that this is how language functions. So language functions under social ontology. Now, why is that important? Because when you throw the Quran in the mix, one of the main aspects of the Quran is that it works by way of social ontology. When you walk into the masjid during Tarawih, you're observing social ontology throughout history. Okay? And language is a part and parcel of that. If you did not have society, like if you have a private language in your head, think about it. If you just speak to yourself and you have, like you don't have language. You couldn't, right? But language is based on your society. You have to be in a social context to be able to communicate. You have to have social ontology for anything to work. And knowledge itself is by way of testimony, it's more fundamental and foundational testimony than other sources of knowledge. And hence, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses this process as a means of bringing knowledge from the Quran and from it. Okay, are we clear on that? Anyways, that was a slight tangent from testimony being fundamental. So everyone's clear, testimony is fundamental. We talked about this yesterday. Is the world flat? We said, no, it's not. The only way we know that the world is round is because of testimony, right? Even if you've seen the YouTube video, you didn't go out in outer space before that YouTube video, etc. Okay? Does Japan exist? Same thing. You know that Japan exists based on unless you've been to Japan. Anyone been to Japan? One person per capita in Japan. 2 people, three of us. Anyway, for the rest of us, we know that Japan exists because there's so many sources of testimonial knowledge, testimony that it exists. We do not deny it, right? And in fact, the Quran uses this, or the preservation of the Quran is in this format, what they call mutawatir. There's so many, testimonies on every single level of change that there's no denying that the Quran wasn't changed. If someone wants to make an interpolation, you'd be very hard pressed to do so. So if you think about how the Quran was revealed, you find that, let's say you have it revealed to the Prophet. The Prophet teaches it's 10 people. Okay, those 10 people, if they want to make a change, they have to what? Ask the Prophet, right? You like to make a change. You can also say no. Okay. Anyway, let's say those 10 people teach 10 other people. What is that? 10 times 10 is 100. One person. Okay. No engineers here, right? Who are good at math? All right. Let's say those 100 people now teach 10 more people. How many do you have now? 1,000. Now, let's say that the Prophet is still alive. If some change needs to be made, you have it's still not going to happen. Those 1,000 people now teach 10 people. Now how many do you have? 10,000, right? 10,000 people. If you want to make a change to the Quran, how many people do you need to get to agree on that? 9,999 people. Right? Yeah. Have you ever tried to get 2 people to agree on something? How many people are married? Okay. Have you ever tried to agree on what to eat dinner at night? You want to go out to a restaurant? Because the dynamic in my house is that when I want something to eat and my wife wants to eat, like, where should we go? We have this long discussion about 10 p.m. and then everything closes anyways. So we're having cereal, right? Point being is that to get that agreement is extremely difficult. The further you are away in history from the origination of the Quran, where the Quran comes from, the more difficult it gets to interpret something into that chain. Because you have more people, level by level by level by level. That's why when I said it's a part of the experience, you experience living Quran when you come in and listen to Tarawih, because it is an evidence of social ontology, right? Which is evidence of that very chain. Okay. Anyway, so our understanding of Japan existing is by way of Fahad in a sense, right? There's so many sources that testify to it. We would be, we'd be off to say that it doesn't exist. Okay. Another example. How do you pronounce this? Love. How do we know this? Testimony, right? Social ontology. We agree that that's how you pronounce love, right? Now, in certain places, they don't pronounce like that. They don't, whatever. But by and large, we understand even pronunciation of words has to come by way of testimony. And again, when you apply this to the Quran, you have a very sophisticated system of pronunciation and tajweed and makharij and all of these things that comes down in the same format. It's mutawatir in a certain sense, right? And by the way, I think that applies only to the Quran in terms of a text, where even the recitation itself has to be in a very specific format, the reading, the pronunciation. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Can testimony be wrong? Of course it can. I'm not saying that it's like absolute perfect knowledge, but if it's wrong, you have to have evidence to show that it's wrong, right? And that evidence may be empirical. It may be some other experience you directly had. You say, okay, people have told me X, Y, and Z. My direct experience is that that's not true. Okay? So just because he's saying testimony is a major source of knowledge for you to be, it doesn't mean that it's absolutely right every single time. Okay, because people could lie to you, right? People could make up stuff, all sorts of things, right? Fake news, whatever you call it. So just because he's saying testimony is fundamental to technology, doesn't mean that there's no other knowledge or other ways to show that it's this is going to become important because one of the contentions of this argument is that, oh, you're saying testimony, but there is a contention. It's wrong because such and such. So you have to bring evidence to say why we believe the testimony about the Quran is true. Okay. All right. Let's get to inference. Now, there's a lot of words up there. I don't want you reading those words just yet. So I'll explain the concept first, then you have to read what's all up there. So stop reading. You know what? Let me do that. Okay. So we talked about testimony. We're going to move on to inference, and here we're talking about inference is the best explanation. Okay, so as human beings, when we have a certain set of data in front of us, we make inferences. Okay, and usually we have to limit ourselves to the best explanation of our. Right, so let me give an example to say this more. So my second born, his name is Rahman, and he loves Takis. You guys have that here? Takis? Pronunciation, I don't know, man. We can get our social ontology and figure out if they're Takis or Takis. Right? I'll go with Takis. All right. He loves Takis. I absolutely hate Takis. Not because of how they taste, because of the fact that nasty orangeness that comes on your fingers, and then that gets rubbed across the entire house. Drives me crazy. Okay. Now he loves these chips from hell. I should say that. Anyways, he really loves them. Okay. So let's imagine now that I go out and I buy a whole bunch of Takis for some guests that are coming over because they said we like Takis. So I bring them home and I tell them they're fine. I say, look, they're fine. There's these Takis. I don't want touching them because they're for the guests. Okay, I'm gonna put them over here in the cupboard or wherever. Don't touch them. They're for the guests tonight. You are not allowed to eat them. Okay, I walk away. And of course, children are perfect. When they tell them something, they never do it. Right? Everyone's like, yes. Okay, anyway. So I come back like an hour. I go off and whatever they do. Come back. I see up there on. He's sleeping on the couch, drooling, and I see this trail of Takis, crumbs, going to the couch with nasty oranges on his fingers, and that oranges on his mouth. And there's a bag of open Takis in the cupboard. Okay? Now, there's a couple of explanations for this. One explanation is that my older son was like, you know what, let's set this guy up. So basically what he did is he took up Rahman, knocked him out, threw him on the couch, spread the Takis on his mouth and his hands, spread the crumbs all the way to the bag, open the bag, and it's gone. Explanation number one. Explanation number two. Rahman really wanted Takis. He went to the kitchen, basically went to the cupboard, ate as many Takis as he possibly could handle and breathed in to the point where he's about to pass out, got to the couch, and passed out. Which explanation do you think is more likely? The second one, right? That is what we mean inference is the best explanation. You can have a number of explanations for a phenomenon. You can infer the best explanation. That is part of the human, how we understand knowledge, how we go out in our day-to-day. That applies within the professional realm as well. So now let's read the statement. So Peter Lipton talks about inference is the best explanation that a doctor inferred that his patient had measles, since this is the best explanation of the evidence before him. Okay. Now there'll be a number of explanations you can give for whatever. A doctor has to pick the best one. Okay. Similarly, the astronomer infers from the existence of the motion of Neptune, since that is the best explanation of the observed perturbations of Uranus. Given our data and our background beliefs, we infer what we would, if true, provide the best of competing explanations that we generate of those data. And what are those? What are the qualities? Number one, it's the most simple explanation, and it's the most comprehensive explanation. So we do this all the time. Okay. So we talked about testimony. We talked about inference to the best explanations. This was the background we needed before we get to the argument. Let us start. Number one, the Quran presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity. So now, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you have doubts, if you're in doubt about what we have revealed to, about the revelation we've sent down to our servant, then produce a single chapter like it, and then list whatever supporters you want if you are telling the truth. So now here's the challenge. Bring a single chapter like that's one in the Quran. That's the challenge. Okay. Okay. So what is being highlighted here is bring something like it, imitate it, and bring something that's equivalent to it. All right. The failure of anyone to imitate the Quran developed into the Muslim theological doctrine of the Quran, that is inimitability, or al-i'jaz of the Quran, we spoke about yesterday. The word i'jaz is a verbal noun. It means miraculousness, comes from the word ajaza. Again, we mentioned that yesterday, to render incapable, to make helpless. So, the linguistic meaning of the term brings to light the theological doctrine that Arabic linguists par excellence were rendered incapable of producing anything like it. Is to incapacitate. You cannot bring anything like linguistic, right? Okay. I'm not going to read what the Tasleem said. I'll just read that some other time. Okay. So number one, that there is a challenge that is given. Bring a Quran like it, bring a surah. Okay, a linguistic challenge. Bring something like it. Number two, the second thing we want to say is that the people who were best suited to meet the challenge were the 7th century Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula. Why is this true? Why is this true? Yes. Yeah, they were the people that were, linguists par excellence. They had the Arabic language to its apex. In fact, Arabic, in a sense, was part of their, very culture and society and everything, right? So, the fact that the 7th century Arabs reached the peak of eloquence is affirmed by Western and Eastern scholarship. Talking about testimony here now, right? How do we know this? We know this both by Western scholarship and by Muslim scholarship. Okay, so they lived in a social cultural environment that had all the right conditions to facilitate unparalleled expertise of the Arabic language. So, Sheikh Taqi Usmani, Abdullah, he says that for the 7th century Arab, eloquence and rhetoric were their lifeblood. That's how basically, your entire environment, your entire society was based upon how good you were rhetorically. And by the way, it's primarily oral. Was it written most of the time? Okay. So, 9th century biographer of poets, Al-Jumahi says, verse was to the Arabs the register of all they knew, and the utmost compass of their wisdom, and with it they begin their affairs, with it they end it. There's a lot of other testimony we can give. Point being is that the entire environment was about surrounding language, eloquence, the ability to articulate, the ability to use prose, the ability to use poetry, rhyme, meter, all of that was part and parcel of the very culture, the very reality you lived at that time. Okay? So, yes. Right. Yes, that's true. So what it is actually is that before a battle starts, they would bring their poets, and each poet would praise each one of the, their own sides. Well, it's really interesting. I was reading an article the other day from a very small tangent, inshallah. The article was talking about how we in the 21st century, approach poetry, and how the Arabs in the 7th century approach poetry. Because most of us do not use rhyme or meter to argue a point. Like you wouldn't go to someone start a rap in the store or something. It's not like, oh, you're an atheist, let me tell you why atheist, you don't start like that, right? But what you find is that was part and parcel of how you would have debates. Like it was not only the point and the pros and the particular argument you're making, but how eloquent were you in making the argument, right? And it's something that we can't even really conceptualize because it's not something that we do. But at that time, language, rhetoric, linguistic ability, capability, all of that was at its apex, right? It was part and parcel of the very environment that you, yeah.
And you can determine how rated by non-Islamic sources.
That's what I just said. So Western sources corroborate this, say this, they know this, it's testimonially well established, and of course Eastern sources, Muslim sources say this, right? Because one contention is like, oh, the sources are just yours. So it must be from bias, right? It's not only just, and we'll get into some testimonies from Western sources as well. But these are some, you'll see them in your notes. Ibn Khaldun talks about it in Muqaddimah and a few others, okay? The Beit Karmani, he says that old Arabic poetry is a highly complex phenomenon. The vocabulary, grammatical idiosyncrasies, and strict norms were passed down from generation to generation, and only the most gifted students fully mastered the language. A person had to study for years, sometimes even decades, under a master poet or laying claim to the idol poet. Muhammad grew up in a world which almost religiously revered poetic expression. Okay, now, so both from Western academic sources, we have testimonies about how language was employed, how it was used, how it was the environment. So you have the challenge, number one. The challenge was given, bring it to our language. The 7th century Arabs were in the best position to meet that challenge. Okay? Number 3, they failed to meet that challenge. Again, we're talking about how do you get to this? You get to this by way of testimonial knowledge. Right? So don't take my word for it. There's plenty of testimonies. Okay? Western sources and Islamic sources. Okay. So number 3, the 7th century Arabs failed to meet the challenge. Okay. Right? The Arabs at that time had reached their linguistic peak in terms of linguistic competence in sciences, rhetoric, oratory, and poetry. No one, however, has been able to provide a single chapter similar to that of the Quran. So let me stop here first. What could someone contend at this point? What's an argument someone can say? If I said, look, man, no one met the challenge. Who decided? Right? But this is why I want to kind of have, because right now the argument just might be floating out here, so abstract. The whole point of mentioning who was best situated to meet the challenge, and us saying that as the 7th century Arabs, is the important point. Why? Because when you think about how language works, language changes over time. And we can say very confidently that Arabic language degenerated. By the way, no other language can make that claim. Degeneration. You want to know why? Okay. The reason why is because just because a language changes, why can we give it a normative value? In other words, who's to say it is correct English and incorrect English? In fact, there's a big debate between linguists. They say, like, can we establish rules in the English language? Some purists say, yes, we can. But then you have others that say, how are you supposed to establish distinct rules about English? Because English is a living, spoken language. You establish rules by way of convention, right? And that convention can change from place to place, community, culture to culture, right? If you go to, let's say, the 5th Ward, a place in Houston, how do you speak English there? You know, who are we to say that they don't speak English correctly, right? Some y'all have been home good, yeah, right? Like, that's incorrect. Why? Right? Who's to say that's incorrect? So you have language purists say, no, you can make that claim. You have others say, no, you can't make that claim. No language, with perhaps the exception of Hebrew, can make a claim that there is a normative standard to the language, and therefore we can confidently say if it differs from the standard, it is not correct. Okay? Languages change over time. Every language happens in every language. Arabic is not excluded from that. But there is a established standard that we can say this is normative. And we know this because of Quran, because of Hadith, because of grammar, marriage, and so on and so forth. Okay? That's a separate issue. What I'm trying to highlight here is to say the 7th century Arabs were the ones who were best placed to meet that challenge, because as soon as they start to expand out of the Arabian Peninsula, what happens to language? It degenerates, right? So now, if the language has degenerated, do people outside of the Arabian Peninsula and outside of that epoch of time, do they have the same tools as the 7th century Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula? No. So that's why I'm saying the people best suited to meet the challenge didn't meet it. Why that's important? Because everyone who comes after that doesn't have the tools. linguistically. Make sense? All right, we'll come up with some extra evidence of this as well. So, all right. So the scholars who testified to the Quran inadmissibility, this is what we were speaking earlier. These are Western testimonies, so notwithstanding the literary excellence of some of the long Islamic poems, the Quran is definitely on the level of its own as the most eminent written manifestation of Arabic language, and there's others. So there's that are making your notes. Okay. Okay. Now, here's the thing: a valid contention concerning academic testimonies of the Quran's inadmissibility is that scholars who agree that the Quran cannot be imitated, or that there is something special about the Quran, have not concluded that it is a divine text. The problem with this contention that conflates testifying the Quran's inadmissibility with the inference of best explanation. Here's the thing: up to this point in the argument, all we want to show is that the Quran cannot be imitated. We haven't come to the point about the Quran is from Allah. Okay, so let me just recap so we kind of know where we are in this argument. Number one, what we talked about is inference of best explanation and testimony. By way of testimony, we can say that number one, that the Arabic language was the culture of the time, right? Arabs were the best equipped to understand, use, and inculcate the Arabic language, right? Arabic in the 7th century. Number two, that there was a challenge. The Quran brings a challenge, and the challenge was bring the Quran like it, bring a chapter like it, bring a surah like it. Number three, the Arabs of the 7th century could not meet that challenge. We know this by way of testimonial knowledge again, both from Western sources and Islamic sources. This is where we are so far. Okay, everyone clear to where we are so far? So we haven't gotten to the point that the promise from Allah is here. Okay, so we're just building the argument right now. All right, moving on. Counter scholarly testimonies are not plausible as they have to reject established background information. Am I saying that there's no Western scholars who said that the Quran it was imitated? No, because you have certain people that says yes, the imitation challenge was met. Okay, but if that's the case, they have to reject certain background information. Is some of that we just spoke about. All right, let's see. What are the implications if you come with a counter testimony to say yes, the challenge is met? Okay, we have to, number one, reject Arabic literary history. Number two, we have to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arabic linguists. And number three, we have to deny the challenge of the Quran. Let's start with number one. Reject Arabic literary history. In other words, what you're going to say is everything we know about the Sia, everything we know about Arabic literary history, we have to take all of that and throw it away. Why? Because here's the thing. The challenge comes down to the 7th century Arabs. Now, we know from Arabic literary history, from our sources, that the Arabs went to war with the Prophet ﷺ. You know about Badr, you know about Uhud, you know about Khandaq, and so on and so on. Okay? We know that the challenge was extant, it was there, right? Now, is it easier just meet the challenge of the Quran, or is it easier to go to war against your enemy? Yeah. The Arabs against the Prophet, let's clarify that, right? So the Arabs against the Prophet, they have a choice. Either they can meet the challenge or they can go to war. Which one's easier? Which one do they choose? Go to war is easier? Who said that? Someone said going to war is easier. So going to war, all your economic resources, sending people to their death, all of that is easier than saying, you know what, let me just be found. Is that what you're saying? Like I'm saying, like logically, is that easier? Like if the challenge needs to be met, what we're saying is that if the challenge needs to be met, they would have done it, right? The fact they didn't do it and they chose to go to war you'd have to reject that part of history. And that's absurd. Because if you reject that part of history, what part of history will you actually accept? You understand what I'm saying? So again, it goes back to social ontology. If you're going to reject one historical fact, all of these historical number of historical facts, that okay, they never went to war. Then what are you saying? You're going to write your own history? Okay, it's absurd. So you have to, number one, you have to reject all of that history. Number two, you have to make a claim that your linguistic ability, let's say you are an Orientalist sitting in some university, your linguistic ability is better than the 7th century Arabs. Can anyone claim that? No. Why? Because that was done at a specific time, a specific place. Once you leave that epoch of time and you leave that place, you have linguistic degeneration. So even if you're Arab today, you wouldn't be able to say, I can read the children of the Quran. You don't have the same linguistic tool to do so. You cannot, right? No one today speaks the Arabic of the 7th century Arabs in Hijaz. Nobody. Because of linguistic generation. Yes, we have a preservation to know the rules and the grammar and the song and all of that thing, so that we can access that language. But natural speech and natural ability, nobody has that. Okay? Yes. Sure. Of course. No, specific Arabic, obviously. That's well known. Yes, of course. Yes. We're getting there.
He's not just the best.
Yeah. We're gonna get there. Right now, we're just talking about testimony and setting the first stage. So we'll get there. Any question? A few times in the challenge. So, for instance, the one that I mentioned, the Baqarah, that happened around the time of Badr, shortly before, shortly after. Don't remember where, but definitely Uhud was there, Ahzab was there. Many battles occurred after the ayah that I mentioned. And there were other challenges. It wasn't the only challenge, right? They're like bring a Quran like it, bring 10 chapters like it, bring one chapter like it. So it wasn't just one time that the challenge made. I think it's 4 different occasions on the challenge made, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah.
So let's say you're talking about they don't even speak Arabic, they're not like us that actually recite Arabic. How do you make this like relevant to them? They don't even understand what the Arabic like. And then you give them like, okay, this is because for them it feels like it's out of their hands. Like this is a language that was at its peak so long ago.
Sure.
And now they're trying to.
But we're not making a linguistic argument. I'm not saying we can look at this linguistic feature of the Quran and see, like, if you do Arabic, you know.
I understand this is like what we're doing,
Right.
but it still feels like a bit like an important.
It might, but then you have to kind of personalize, right? That's kind of the skill you have to learn. All right. How do you make testimonial knowledge real to someone that doesn't even think about it? You know, you can ask them about the earth being round and all those things that we went through. Come up with your own example. Right? Because at some point you have to kind of admit, okay, yeah, most of my knowledge is tested. If you have a person who's admitted that, then you can say, okay, so testimony has value. And if it has value, then we have to take it seriously. And if we take it seriously, then these are the testimonies that are there. You can check them yourself pretty well. You know, yeah. I mean, you'll notice I don't refer to the Arabic language in terms of eloquence here, in the sense that I'm giving you an ayah and I'm breaking it down, showing you why, you know, there's an fact here, or this word is here, or that. None of that's here. It's simply just a philosophical argument that's grounded in the principles of the testimony. Right? So, okay. So here's the thing. So the Arabs didn't meet, 7th century Arabs didn't meet the challenge. If someone tries to say we can meet the challenge today, they have to, again, reject Arabic literary history, claim greater linguistic ability than 7th century Arabs, or just deny that the Quran really did it. Then you just, whatever. It just say, okay, take half out. Okay. Linguistic meagerness. When analysis of the work of scholars who testify against the Quran's inability to perform, the results conclude the linguistic meagerness of this type of scholarship. Okay? An example of its inadequacy can be found in the work of the highly acclaimed German Orientalist and scholar Theodor Nobel, where he says, perceived linguistic ugliness and ittifaq. The fact that he didn't have an understanding of ittifaq, right off the bat tells you, like, he's not equipped to even deal with the Quran in any form or fashion. Ittifaq is pretty basic. I actually went over an example yesterday. Okay? So, even aside from that, though, just understanding how language works, the fact that it generates over time, you can't claim the same linguistic prowess that you can in the sense of Arabs, even if you were born in an Arab household, even if you spoke Arabic before, because that language, it's not extant at the moment. It's not, right? It was only for the 7th century Arabs. Okay, so if that's the case, therefore 1 and 5, the Quran is inadmissible. All right, so we haven't come to the actual argument yet. All we're saying right now is therefore no one can imitate it. Is that clear? Everyone make sense? Okay. Now, let's look at, okay, if it's inadmissible, what are the possible explanations? This is where we get to where did the Quran come from? Possible explanations. So either it was an Arab that put it together, that proposed it, either it was a non-Arab that put it together, or it was the Prophet, or it comes from Allah. These are your 4 kind of deductive possibilities. Okay? So let's ask the question about an Arab. All right, well, hold on a second. Yeah. So it could either be produced by an Arab, a non-Arab, or Muhammad. So let's start with an Arab. Could it have been an Arab? Yes, no? Based on what we said so far? It could have been. Okay. Sure, but that's what I'm saying. We're trying to knock out these possibilities, right? So what we're saying is that it could have been an Arab. But I already stated why it could have been an Arab. Do you want to know why? Right. So the Arabs of the 7th century couldn't be the challenge. We have also evidence for that, not only the fact testimonial knowledge, but also Arab literary history. The Arabs of the 7th century could be the challenge. Could the Arabs outside the 7th century be the challenge? No. Why? Linguistic degeneration, right? They couldn't do it either. So could it have been an Arab? No. All right. Could it have been non-Arab? Well, now you exacerbated the issue, right? Because if you're not an Arab, then forget linguistic degeneration. You have learning Arabic as a second language. And anyone that's studying languages, your second language is never as good as your mother tongue, ever, no matter how long you spend studying. So not only do you have linguistic degeneration to compete with, you also have Arabic being the second or third or fourth language, which means it's even more degenerate. So it could have been a non-Arab. No. Okay. Could it have been the Prophet? Well, a very easy way of looking at this is saying, well, he was an Arab. We already said it's not Arab, so boom, we're done. If it's true he's an Arab, we already said it could have been an Arab, that's done. But the other thing is that there's a couple of, you can say, bolstering facts. Okay, so the argument can easily be settled by saying, look, he was an Arab, or he said it can't be an Arab, he falls in that category, and so therefore we're done. Okay. All right. Some people will say, oh yes, he composed it, but he was a genius, like Shakespeare. Okay. The problem is that the revelation of the Quran, was there an editing process that happens? Okay, do you think Shakespeare was in the editing process? Absolutely, right? So here's the thing, the fact that it was a sustained, unedited, unchanged, unmatched eloquence, you're not going to get Shakespeare here when compared to what the Quran is like. Because there's no process of editing, thinking about it, going back, writing it again, thinking about, okay, hold on a second, I like this rhetorical fact instead of this rhetorical fact. None of that happens. The second there's an incident in the life of the Prophet, there's revelation, right? So there's no sort of editing, there's no sort of, there's no sort of back and forth. So we can't say it was just based on genius. If that is the case, then you're only left with one explanation. And that explanation is from Allah. Okay? So this is the deductive way in which we show that the Quran is false. And I know it seems like a really long process, but once you go through it, you've understood it, to articulate it, it's much easier. I just kind of done it step by step so it's kind of clear to you. Make sense? Okay. So what we're gonna do now is, well, we can do a few things. We can break for like 5-10 minutes and come back for some Q&A, or we can do some Q&A and just break. So which one do you guys rather? Q&A and just break? Okay. Listen. What questions do you guys have? Oh, really? No questions? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Okay. Right. Right. Of course. No, no doubt. Of course. The point is that you gotta take that challenge, man. I can just teach it and leave. You guys have to now put it into practice. So no, look, I understand. It seems like a lot, but like the divine value book is available as a game online, download free. The entire argument is mentioned in there, right? So now that you have kind of, in this setting being taught the argument, once you go to it, you've internalized it, you'll be able to personalize it in such a way that you will express it in the best way that you can, right? Such that the person can relate to it, inshallah, right? And that's true for whatever we spoke about, right? So we talk about the dependency argument. You need to put that in your own words. Think about it. Okay, how does this work? How do when I define dependent, how is it such that I can make it clear to me that when I express it, the person will understand? And how will they hear it? And such I need to express it in a way that they'll be able to understand, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also part of personalizing it. I think it's useful to taste it a little bit, like listen for
Perhaps. Sure. Yep. 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 Yeah, so here's the thing. If you remember from our diagram way back when, right? Actually, I don't know. I don't know. But remember that heart, and it was clouded, and it had all those arrows pointing towards it. You guys remember the diagram? The one that was pointed is in rational arguments. That's one tool that you have, but you use that tool in addition to, or maybe even exclusion to, the other tools you have. So we talked about spirituality. We talked about character. We talked about, so many different things. The Quran itself, the recitation of the Quran. How many people actually recite the Quran when they're giving lectures, right? Rarely you'll find that. At least in this stage, I remember the only person I can think of right now was Sheikh Muhammad al-Sharif, rahimahullah, the founder of Al-Maghrib. You guys know Al-Maghrib Institute? So the founder, when he would give lectures, when he would say the Quran, or when he would mention something in the Quran, he would recite it. It was so powerful. I mean, he has a really good recitation. I think he had a really good recitation, rahimahullah. But maybe just the combination of the oratory sensation of the Quran plus the argument is where you need to go, right? So you have a number of tools in your toolbox to be able to guide you, right? Don't just limit it to rational explanations. Now, I was mentioning to someone earlier that Ibn Taymiyyah has a very interesting statement about this, talking about rational explanations or rational arguments. He says, rational arguments is not nutrition for everyone. It is medicine for the sick. In other words, rational arguments is not something you use with every single person, right? Some people, it's not about rationality, right? They may have some personal trauma that they're going through, and they just need to know, okay, well, how do I deal with this? What does Islam say about dealing with this trauma? And that is just an existential breath of fresh air for them. I never thought about it. Some people are just looking for purpose. What's the purpose of my life? And you just tell them this is what it is. It's to worship Allah, to be grateful, and so on and so forth. That's all they need, right? Some people it's the Quran. Some people it's just taking a walk in the natural world, and that has an impact on them, such that you say this is what Islam is about. And so there's so many different ways that you come about this, and you don't use these. You don't have to use these in just a vacuum. You use them with those other elements as well. Yes. So here we're talking about morality or rules. Right. So sure. So again, when we talk about revelations, it's not added layer to this. There's obviously the revelation is the interpretation of that revelation, and which there's room for that. Okay. So let me give an example. Okay. And check out what you correct if I'm wrong in this area. I don't want to misquote any of the schools in John. But when so let me ask you this, check out in the Hanafi madhab, can you start fasting midday? Like you wake up, you haven't eaten anything, you just like, oh, I'll fast. Okay, so can you do that for a sunnah fast? Or like a non-fast fast? Okay, so I guess it's not, one of the madhab said, okay. Now, the Jamhur, all of the madhab, when they looked at this issue of fasting, okay, about like, let's say you wake up around 12 o'clock, right? Let's say on Monday, you want to fast outside of Ramadan, and you're like, I want to fast. Okay, so the question is, can you do that? You just wake up and fast. So there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ wakes up and he asks Aisha, is there something to eat? And Aisha says, no, there's nothing to eat. He says, inni sa'im. Okay. Now the thing is, you might think, okay, this hadith is very clear. He said, I am fasting. But now it depends on whether you interpret sa'im in this sense or you interpret it in the Sharia sense. Okay? If you interpret that to mean I am fasting, then you can say, all right, well now you have evidence to say you wake up in the day, middle of the day, and if you haven't eaten anything, you start to fast. Okay? However, actually now that I think about people, I'm mistaken. However, one way of looking at this hadith is I'll say, Siyam, the process of here is not speaking about soul in the sense of fasting, but the sense that I haven't had anything to eat and I'm hungry. Because linguistically, that's what it actually refers to. So in this case, the process of just stating the fact, saying, in the sign, I am just in a state where I have eaten. So therefore, a ruling would be, you cannot do that. You have to start the day fast. Okay? This comes up to a different interpretation. Now, how do you have other evidence and things like that? In this case, whatever madhab you follow, as long as you have the intention, you'll be following the right thing because it's open to a difference of interpretation. Now the question is, which one is objectively true? Okay. And the reality is certain things you may not know whether they're true or not. But it doesn't come to an issue of being objectively true because you're not making a 50 opinion, right? On something like that. So does that clarify things? Because you're at the level of interpretation, okay, which adds another level. Yes. From what I remember, we don't, it just that's that. He said in the sign that's it. From what I remember. There's no added details. So because there's no added details, one assumption could be, okay, we decided to fast. One assumption could be, no, we just stayed being distributed. So and by the way, these aspects of difference of opinion, I mean, once you start studying, it actually really does help whoever gets to study Islamic law. Is that a true statement? Right? Because then you start realizing that a lot of these things that a lot of people are so stringent on, and some things you need to be very, very stringent on, like very firm. But some things, when there's a difference of opinion, you know, you have to basically, you take what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, right? Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, you know, ask the people of knowledge if you don't know, right? Yes. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Right. Yeah. I mean, again, like there's valid thing is like this goes back to evidence and technology. There's so many different things you have to get to before you're like, okay, now I understand. Right? It could be something linguistic, like in this hadith that I mentioned. It could be something in terms of methodology, how you derive certain rules. Let's say if now have a certain procedure of how they derive certain rules. How do you categorize hadith? How do you categorize rulings themselves? Right? So let's say the Jamhur, you have something that's fard, you have something that's let's say mustahab, mubah, makruh, and haram. I believe you cannot have a few other categories, right? And they have evidence for it. So the point is, I mean, these are differences, and you know, it's part of being global and just coming together as a community. I really do think it's now territory of situation that should be treated to. So sure, 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 sure. So I'll end on this point. It's really important, and this is why it's really important to have leadership, because the Prophet has said, follow your imam. Allah has blessed you with an imam. So that's basically, even if we come from different backgrounds, things like that, there's a reason why you have a hierarchy of your imam and the congregation, things like that. I think that's kind of one of the benefits of having an imam. He's not say, we'll leave it to the discretion of the imam. Whatever he's going to say, we're going to do that. Right? Ask the people know. If you don't know, and most of us are not at the level of studies and all these other things. So that's what I would say. You know, this is what any community I visit, I always say, look, mom is the one that has to say in any aspect, and generally, especially when you get questions related to film and marriage, divorce, things like that, I say that's the person you can ask. The best. Okay, coming back to the topic. Any other questions related to the topic? Stop. Yes. Sure. So that's one of the reasons why it's inadmissible. That it cannot be imitated. That it changes every language. That's any language. No, I'm saying English does. English changes all the time. So I said that there's a debate within linguists to say, yes, there's a right English and a wrong English. That's one camp. But there's another camp that says there's no way to say there's a right English and a wrong English because everybody knows language change. No, Arabic has degenerated all the time. Right. So what I'm saying is that even though it's degenerated, we still can say this is the correct way of understanding, let's say, trying to speak as close as we can, right? But no one can naturally speak the language of the 7th century Arabs. We have all the tools we need. That's why we can appreciate the linguistic miracles and things like that on the Quran. The tools are still there. But a natural Arabic speaker, you have to have the environment and that closed off homogeneous environment specifically. I mean, the thing that's kind of unique about 7th century Hijaz is that it was by and large closed off, right? So yes, we had some trade going north, some trade going south. By and large, most superpowers just passed by it. Like why go into a whole bunch of desert? So that homogeneous environment at that time in that culture, when you learn a language at that point, you brought to that situation, those are the only people that can match the claim of indivisibility, right? If they were, and they didn't do it either. Once you leave that particular time and that particular area, now you're going to suffer from linguistic degeneration. So even though the scholars preserve the tools, right? So we know Arabic grammar, no eloquence, balagha, and so on and so forth. It's like 12, 13, 14 sciences of the Arabic language. We know those things, but we know that it's kind of like mathematical or clinical tools that we put together to appreciate the language of the Quran. And because we have the Quran, we can say that is real, normal, standard, how Arabic should be, even though no one can actually speak like that, right? People come close. So if you ever listen to lectures in Arabic, let's say you go to Russian Nabawi or something like that, they try their best to speak Muslim. But you will never, because if you think about it, over time, you're going to reach a number of different phenomena, right? You need to express those phenomena somehow. So Arabs in the 7th century, their exposure to certain phenomena was limited to the peninsula, right? Once you leave the Arab Peninsula and you leave that time period, now you're exposed to new phenomena. So maybe you have to come up with new words. Maybe you have to, maybe someone's not born in Arabia and have to learn language, have to pronounce things, and so on and so on and so forth, right? So linguistic degeneration happened with Arabic too. Like no one today can claim that I can speak the Arabic of like most of perfect. Does that make sense? Sure. Yeah, but that's why we said this testimony right? So yeah, exactly. Well, that whole idea of Arabic being the lingua franca was that Arabic was basically the culture that they would have to keep the eloquence and so on and so forth. That comes by the testimony. That's what we're speaking about testimony, and it's vital and indispensable part of this. So you can't do away with it. So if we agree we can't do away with it, then testimonial sources are going to be valid until you come with counter testimony. And that's why we said counter testimony doesn't work for all the reasons we said, right? You have to reject Arabic literary history, you have to basically claim greater linguistic excellence, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So what I'll recommend is read the chapter of the book, go over it, and take some time to marinate, and hopefully it'll be used today. Make sense? Yes.
So it's pretty straightforward. Someone that the top 55 person,
Okay.
that it wasn't changed. There are some people who say that parts of it are impacted or hidden.
Okay.
Like that. So how do you do that?
What's the evidence? What's the testimonial evidence? Right. So the evidence, right? The claim is the one that brings the evidence, right? According to social ontology, right, in the Muslim world, that it's been preserved, right? And again, like I said, got that entire chain with a lot of structure that we recognize. We talk about recognizing Japan, whatever. So if someone go against that, who should bring the evidence? They have to bring the evidence, right? Right? So they have to walk into the masjid during the Tarawih and be stop! This ayah is not in the Quran, right? And see what happens. Okay. Yes.
There have been attempts made to, basically,
Sure.
even today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just because we have a different set of, a different language today compared to what it was
Finally, they will learn the language. You know, like anything, it's not, they don't have to. But see,
Really?
isn't it? Why not?
Well, here's the thing. If the best speakers complete the challenge, how would you argue that someone that is not even close, that has a degenerate form of the language, they don't even have the tools to meet the challenge? Okay. How many languages do you speak? Wow, mashallah, that's good. But what language do you speak? Okay. All right, which is your weakest language? Maybe Arabic. Okay, what's your second weakest language? Okay, third weakest language. Urdu. Okay, so your strongest language is English. Okay. So if you were to say, let me go refine my Urdu skills, like that's your second, right? A native speaker of Urdu, you could never get to a native speaker level. Okay, that's number one. That's your first challenge. And so that's challenge very well known Muslim linguists. It could be by your own experience. You will never get to the point where the fluency and the direct nature of the language as it's by a native speaker, then you could reach that level. That's your first challenge. Your second challenge would be that language, pure language, doesn't exist. It's not spoken. There's no way to learn it in the sense that you are born into that language. There's no way to do that because 7th century is gone and you guys open it up. So you've got two challenges, which neither one of them. Does that make sense? Right? So even if you say, okay, you listen to your degeneration, like I can possibly learn the language, right? That's the one that's a huge claim to make and a huge challenge. You know, you'd be hard pressed to find anything that would say, yes, that's correct. Number two, the fact that the language itself is not extant, you've got that challenge, right? Even if you were, let's say, born in an Arabic household, today, now, in any country, right? Morocco or any country. I was not that in Morocco. Okay. Yes. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, of course not. Yeah. Decades of study, yeah. Right. And keep in mind that that's decades of study in a homogenous environment. I mean, you're talking about, let's say, the Arab world now, you have globalization, all this other stuff that's going on now. Right? The Arabs of the 7th century in the Hijaz were generally closed off. So when they were learning language, it was very insular, right? You know that, for instance, we know from the Sierra that children be sent out to the middle of the desert to practice their language. The Prophet was sent to, to practice language, right? He sent out in the desert for whatever reason. So that you have to basically reenact all of that in order to come to a place where you have the right tools to imitate the language. And it's just not possible because it's not extant, it doesn't exist. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people can try, but they haven't come across the argument. So, anyways, yes. No. So I didn't say least degenerate. What I said was, it is the only language that has a normative standard by which you can say this is correct Arabic, this is incorrect Arabic. No other language can claim that because how do you claim that? What evidence do you have to say this is correct English, this is incorrect English? I said Hebrew may come close because they have somewhat of a standard related to the Torah, but even that becomes complicated because the Torah has changed, right? And even dictionaries and things like that, they didn't start thinking about that until they saw Muslim. So I don't know, the jury's out on that. So okay, we're gonna go ahead and conclude there, inshallah. Husband has made the declaration, boom, done, inshallah. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you, bless all your families. It was very nice being here, visiting your community. I hope that you're able to benefit to some extent. If I went on too long before you were, you fell asleep in the middle, so please apologize for that. If you were to benefit from anything, Again, that's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And any sort of mistakes, anything like that is all self. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from all of you, and may He give you the best of this life and the best of the afterlife, and may He allow all of us to meet at the hope. Know that pond where the process of giving everyone water, giving everyone drink, that once you drink, you can never thirst again. I ask Allah to allow us to meet there and the best. And then we can go, inshallah. SubhanAllah.